Becca Callahan stood in the parking lot of a funeral home on a gray afternoon in early spring, close enough to her mother that their shoulders nearly touched. She was greeting a line of mourners she had known for most of her 44 years on this earth, people who had watched her grow up, people who had shaped every memory she carried of her father. She believed, without question, that she knew every single person who had ever mattered to him. She had no idea that the truth of who her father really was would arrive in that very parking lot before the funeral service even began. A car pulled in slowly, almost as if whoever sat behind the wheel was still deciding, even at this final moment, whether to go through with arriving at all. A woman stepped out first, close to her mother's age, dressed in the same simple, dark, careful clothing that told you she understood exactly what this day would cost her. Becca barely had time to wonder who she was before the door on the other side of the car opened, and a young man stepped out to join her, somewhere in his late 20s. It was the young man who made the breath catch in Becca's chest before either stranger had said a single word. He had her father's exact walk. He had her father's exact way of holding his shoulders, the same slight tilt of the head when he studied an unfamiliar crowd, a mannerism Becca had watched her entire life and would have recognized instantly, on anyone, anywhere. Becca had said goodbye to her father 100 times over, in her own mind, long before this particular day ever arrived. She had quietly prepared herself, she believed, for every version of grief a funeral could possibly bring a daughter. She never once imagined that the hardest goodbye of the day would not belong to her father at all. It would belong to the version of him she had spent her entire life believing was the only version that had ever existed. This is a true story of a double life, of the people who loved him anyway, and of a family that no one standing in that parking lot yet knew they were also there to grieve. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Becca Callahan did not yet know, standing in that lot with her mother's arm looped through hers, was that her father had spent nearly 4 decades quietly living 2 entirely separate lives, in 2 different towns, as 2 different versions of the same devoted, dependable, ordinary man. She did not yet know that the young man walking toward her carried her father's blood in him just as certainly as she did. She did not yet know his name, or his mother's name, or how long the 3 of them, without ever meeting, had already been connected. She did not yet know about the storage unit her father had quietly rented under his own name for over a decade, sitting less than 2 hours from the house she grew up in, filled with photographs and birthdays she had never once been invited to witness. She did not yet know about the letters, more than a dozen of them, written and abandoned across 15 years, each one an attempt at a confession her father never once found the courage to finish. All of that was still ahead of her. All Becca knew, in this single frozen moment outside a funeral home, was that the ground beneath the life she thought she understood had just begun, quietly and irreversibly, to shift beneath her feet, and that nothing about the man she was about to bury was going to be as simple as she had believed it was only a few minutes earlier. By the end of that afternoon, 4 people would be standing at the center of a story none of them had chosen for themselves. There was Robert Callahan, the father being buried that day, a man everyone in that funeral home believed they understood completely. There was Carol Callahan, his wife of over 40 years, the woman who had built her entire adult life beside him. There was Becca Callahan, his daughter, the one now quietly piecing together a version of her father she had never been shown. And standing near the back of the chapel, uncertain of their welcome, were 2 strangers, whose connection to Robert none of them yet understood. This story will ask you 3 questions, and it will not let go of you until it has answered every one of them. Who was the woman standing near the back of that funeral home, and who was the young man beside her, the one who carried Robert's exact walk in his own body? How does a man live 2 entire, separate lives, in 2 different towns, for nearly 4 decades, without either family ever discovering the other existed? And once a truth this large finally comes to light, is it still possible to love someone completely when you realize you never actually knew the whole of who they were? The answers were sitting, quite literally, Inside a home no one had thought to search yet. An old photo album filled with birthdays no one in the Callahan family had ever attended. A second cell phone, discovered in the back of a drawer, its contact list full of names that meant nothing to Becca, and everything to the truth. And a will, waiting to be read in the coming weeks, containing a name that belonged to no one anyone in that family had ever been introduced to. Robert and Carol Callahan were married young, the way so many couples of their generation were, with far more certainty than two people in their early 20s had any real right to. They were broke in the ordinary way young couples are broke, and they were deeply, unreasonably in love, in that particular way that convinces two people they can survive absolutely anything life decides to put in front of them. Becca was born within the first few years of their marriage, and for a while, their life together looked exactly like the life they had promised each other it would become. Not long after Becca's birth, Carol went through something neither she nor Robert had a proper name for at the time, a heaviness that settled into her so completely and so suddenly that she eventually had to be hospitalized for an extended stay. Robert was only in his late 20s, left alone with a newborn daughter and a marriage he genuinely did not know, from one week to the next, whether it would survive. It was, by every account later pieced together, the loneliest and most frightening stretch of his young adult life. It was during that exact stretch of loneliness that Robert met a woman named Diane Whitmore. What began as simple companionship between two people who each happened to need someone to talk to, slowly, quietly, became something neither of them had originally set out looking for. Neither of them, by most accounts, ever intended for it to become what it eventually became. Carol recovered. She came home. She and Robert made the decision so many couples of their era quietly made, choosing to rebuild what had nearly been lost, choosing to move forward without looking back too closely at the year that had almost ended them completely. But by the time that decision was made, Diane was already pregnant with a son, a boy, who would eventually be named Tyler Whitmore, and Robert Callahan discovered that he could not bring himself to fully walk away from either woman, or from either child, or from either version of the life he had, somehow, without ever truly intending to, begun quietly building for himself. What followed was not the story of a man who set out from the very beginning to deceive two entire families for his own gain. What followed was something far quieter, and in many ways far harder to neatly categorize. Robert was not scheming. Robert was avoidant, a man who chose silence in the single moment that silence would end up costing him the most, and who then spent the following 4 decades of his life unable to undo that first silence, without unraveling every single year that came stacked on top of it. He told himself, according to letters that would not surface until many years later, that he would eventually find the right moment to tell the truth. He told himself this so many times, across so many years, that the telling itself slowly became a private promise he kept making to himself, and kept quietly breaking, one more time, and then another, for most of the rest of his adult life. He told himself it was only one conversation, one he would have eventually, when the time finally felt right. He simply never found a single day in 40 years that felt brave enough to have it in. For more than 3 decades, Robert Callahan lived a life divided carefully between 2 towns roughly 2 hours apart, a life made possible by his career as a regional insurance claims adjuster, a job that gave him a plausible, entirely unremarkable reason to be traveling constantly, gone for stretches of days at a time, without raising any real suspicion in either household he returned to. He kept a second phone hidden in his truck. He split holidays and birthdays quietly between 2 families who never once crossed paths. He watched 2 children grow into adults, Becca in one town and Tyler in another, each of them simply missing their father on the weeks he was away for work, neither of them aware that the version of their father who wasn't home was, at that very same moment, fully present in someone else's living room instead, being a father there too. Then Robert Callahan died suddenly of a heart attack, at 68 years old, and both of the lives he had spent 40 years keeping so carefully apart collided at once, in a single parking lot, and then inside a single chapel, on a single afternoon, that neither family had any way of preparing for. Diane Whitmore and her son Tyler approached the guest book slowly, uncertain, and it was Carol who recognized her first, before either woman had spoken a single word to the other. Something crossed Carol's face in that moment that Becca would later describe, not as shock exactly, but as something closer to quiet recognition, the particular look of a question finally being answered after decades of almost, but never quite, being asked out loud. Diane spoke first, gently, to no one in particular, and to everyone in the room at once. She said simply that she believed they had both loved the same man. Becca looked at Tyler's face for the very first time in her life, and found that she could not stop looking at it, because looking at Tyler's face was, in every way that mattered, like looking directly at a photograph of her own father at 28 years old. In the space of one quiet sentence spoken near a guest book, Becca Callahan gained a brother she had never known existed, and lost, for the second time that day, the father she had believed she had already finished grieving only hours before. In the days that followed, unable to simply sit inside a silence this large, Becca began pulling at every thread she could find. She discovered old bank statements with withdrawals she could not immediately explain. She discovered a storage unit rented under her father's name that no one in the family had ever known existed. She discovered, tucked inside a folder of old paperwork, an apartment lease from decades earlier, in a town 2 hours from the house she had grown up in, a lease that had apparently been quietly renewed, year after year, for nearly the entirety of her life. For a while, Becca suspected the worst version of every possible explanation available to her. She wondered if her father had been running some kind of financial scheme, if the storage unit and the second lease were evidence of hidden assets, of a man quietly protecting money from his own family, for reasons she could not yet begin to understand. That theory fell apart completely the moment she finally opened the storage unit and found nothing inside it resembling wealth or deception of that kind, only boxes of ordinary, sentimental belongings, a child's crayon drawings, old ticket stubs, photographs from birthdays she had never once been invited to. For a while, she also found herself suspecting Diane, wondering whether Diane had known from the very beginning that Robert was already a married man, whether she had pursued him fully aware of the family she was helping him quietly betray. That suspicion softened considerably the day Becca finally sat down across from Diane in person, and Diane, with what appeared to be genuine and deeply uncomfortable honesty, admitted that Robert had told her, decades earlier, a version of his past that made it sound finished rather than ongoing, a story convincing enough that Diane had built an entire life on top of it without ever fully confirming whether any of it was actually true. And for a while, painfully, Becca even found herself suspecting her own mother, wondering if Carol had somehow known the full truth all along and had simply chosen, out of pride or fear or both, never to speak a word of it. That particular suspicion was the hardest one to sit with, and it eventually led to the most difficult conversation of the entire investigation, a quiet evening in which Carol finally told her daughter the truth she had been carrying alone for most of her adult life. Carol admitted that decades earlier, she had found a strange receipt among Robert's belongings, evidence of a life she could not immediately explain away. She admitted that she had asked him about it exactly once, had accepted the vague, unconvincing answer he offered her, and had made a conscious decision after that single question never to ask him again. She told Becca that after everything she had already survived, after the hospitalization, after nearly losing her marriage and her family in one terrifying year, she had simply become too afraid of what a second question might end up costing her. She chose, quite deliberately, not to look any closer at a life she had already begun to suspect might not fully belong to her alone. Diane's own private confession surfaced not long after. She admitted that she, too, had always sensed that Robert never fully explained certain stretches of his past, certain absences, certain silences of his own. She admitted that she had made the same quiet choice Carol had made, for the very same underlying reason. She had simply been too afraid of what asking too many questions might eventually cost her as well. Every question Becca managed to answer during those difficult weeks seemed to lead her back, again and again, to the very same uncomfortable truth. Nearly everyone at the center of this story had, at some point along the way, made the identical quiet choice her mother had made. Everyone involved had decided, at one time or another, that it was simply safer not to look too closely. The final piece of the story arrived not as a spoken confession, because Robert Callahan never lived long enough to offer one out loud, but as a box Becca eventually found buried inside that storage unit, tucked beneath the old photographs, containing more than a dozen letters. Each one was addressed to both Carol and Diane together. Each one appeared to have been written across a span of more than 15 years, and every single one of them had been abandoned, unfinished, somewhere in the middle of the page. The letters revealed a man who had tried, again and again, across more than a decade, to finally tell the truth, and who had lost his nerve every single time before he ever reached the final line. But the most recent letter in that box was dated only 6 weeks before his death. In it, Robert wrote that he had finally, after everything, decided he was going to tell both families the truth, together, in person, that coming spring. He wrote that he had already quietly begun restructuring his will so that Becca and Tyler would be provided for equally, regardless of how that difficult conversation eventually unfolded. Robert Callahan died of a sudden heart attack 3 weeks before the date he had apparently already chosen for that conversation to finally take place. He had not chosen the lie forever. He had simply run out of time to finish telling the truth. Becca read that final letter aloud to her mother first, and then, separately, to a half-brother she had known for less than a month. It became, in every sense that truly mattered, the closest thing to a real confession her father would ever be able to give either family, arriving decades too late, delivered in his own handwriting instead of his own voice. When the will was formally read, it confirmed exactly what that final letter had promised. Robert had already divided his estate evenly between both families months before his death, not as a chaotic scramble carried out after he was gone, but as a calm, deliberate decision made in what turned out to be the final months of his life, in the middle of a man finally, for the first time in nearly 40 years, trying to do right by everyone he loved all at once. Carol and Diane did not become friends. That would have asked far too much of either woman, and this story has no real interest in pretending otherwise. But something quieter did pass between them by the end. A wordless understanding shared between two women who had each loved the very same complicated, imperfect man, and who had each, in their own separate way, been both lied to and loved by him at exactly the same time. Becca and Tyler chose something different for themselves. What had begun as the single most painful afternoon of Becca's entire life slowly became the beginning of a relationship with a brother she never once knew she had. Two people built from the very same quiet, frightened man, learning together, slowly, how to make sense of the two entirely different fathers he had somehow, impossibly, managed to be at once. Robert Callahan spent nearly 40 years being two different fathers, two different husbands, and one deeply frightened man who never quite learned how to say the hardest thing out loud while he still had time left to say it. He was not a monster, and the people who loved him would tell you that much without a moment of hesitation. But he was not innocent either, and no amount of good intention gathered in his final months could undo 4 decades of silence that had already quietly shaped 2 entire families without their knowledge or their consent. In the end, he was simply a man who ran out of road before he ever ran out of reasons to keep driving forward instead of finally turning back. If someone you loved was carrying a secret this large, a secret this old, would you rather have known everything, even if the truth arrived all at once, and completely reshaped your understanding of your own life? Or would you have preferred to never find out at all, and gone on loving only the version of them you had always believed, without question, was real? Tell us in the comments, do you believe Robert deserves to be forgiven for what he did, or does the length and the depth of the lie outweigh everything he tried to make right at the very end of his life? And if this particular story stayed with you, wait until you hear about the inheritance that turned 2 sisters, who had been closed their entire lives, into complete strangers almost overnight. Subscribe to Shadows of Trust, because every shadow hides a story.